Hi, this is Mike from Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and on today's video we'll be taking a look at MSI's B460M Mortar WiFi, the motherboard which is obsolete before I've even taken it out of the box. Keep watching to find out more. Okay, so in today's video we'll be taking a look at the currently obsolete B460M Mortar WiFi from MSI. Now, this is kind of like a running joke, but essentially with the new Rocket Lake CPUs being announced pretty much today, unfortunately that means that as it stands at the moment, there is no support for Rocket League on this particular motherboard, which is Intel's 11th generation. The B460, as it stands, is for the 10th gen only, which actually is quite a rarity. It's not often that Intel has a motherboard or a chipset which is for one particular generation only. So that is taking me by a little bit of surprise. I was expecting a little bit more out of Intel, but hey, this is why they are who they are. Anyway, why have we chosen for Intel for this particular motherboard and also with this particular chip? Now, for those of you that are watching this video pretty much on release date, then you'll pretty much understand why. Because we are in COVID times. Also for us here in the United Kingdom, we also have the added impact of things like Brexit. And also there's things like the Chinese New Year, we've just had the Christmas holidays, so the supply chain has been completely decimated. So trying to get hold of a mid-range or even a low-end AMD processor at the moment is like finding hen's teeth. So we've had to switch gears a little bit, and I've managed to pick up one of these. This is the Intel Core i3 10100F. So this is the non-iGPU version. This at the moment retails in the UK for around about £75, which is absolutely phenomenal value for money and is effectively a very good replacement for the Ryzen 3 3100 and considerably cheaper with pretty much none of the downsides other than there is a limitation on overclocking, but we can get into that in another video, especially when we do the actual build. This is going to be part of a build which is actually replacing the motherboard and processor, which is in the PC behind me. So if you want to see how all of that goes, then don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the chime button, and you'll be notified of future video releases. So let's get back to the motherboard. So this is, as you can see, is the MSI B460M Mortar WiFi. Now, like I said before, this is the Wi-Fi version. It costs about £10 to £15 more here in the UK. Definitely worth looking at if you want the flexibility of having AC Wi-Fi and also Bluetooth connectivity. For me, really, it's a no-brainer. If you're going to be adding Wi-Fi at some point, maybe you're building a system for somebody, or maybe you're just future-proofing a little bit, for the sake of the extra 5, 10, maybe £15 at a push on the price of the motherboard, it certainly is cheaper than most integrated cards. Certainly some of the ones that we've reviewed already, which handily you can check out up here. So why did I choose B460 as a platform? Well, essentially, with the Intel chip I was choosing, there is extremely limited options on what we can actually do in return to any overclocking, either on the memory or the CPU itself. So I wanted a motherboard which would allow it to boost to its highest boost frequencies without too much fuss. Now, I could have gone for a H410 motherboard, which would have reduced the cost by probably about £30 or so. But really, they do miss out on a lot of features. This board is packed with tons of features. We've got addressable RGB, we've got the M.2 cooling, we've also got huge heat sinks. So as far as kind of budget-ended B460 boards go, especially in the micro ATX form factor, this, in my opinion, is definitely one to look at. And obviously, I bought it out of my own money, so I'd be a fool not to think it's a great board. So let's take a look at the packaging, take a look at the motherboard, and then we'll fire up, have a look in the BIOS, see what settings are actually available, and then I'll come back with my final thoughts at the end of the video. So if you want to know if it's worth buying or not, fast forward to the end of the video and you can find out. Otherwise, stick around and you can sit along for the ride. Okay, so starting off with the packaging, pretty much usual deal for MSI, as you can see. So is the B460M Mortar WiFi, as we've discussed numerous times already. Obviously, MSI do support the ESL League for pro esports, etc. So they have to get that on there. Also, it supports the B460 chipset, as we've discussed. It supports the Intel Core processors, so that's i3, i5, i7, i9, and also some of the Celeron chips as well. There is a full list of supported chips, which I'll put in the video description below, so you can click on the link to MSI's website, and that will link to the current list of supported CPUs. Obviously, if things do change, and this does end up supporting 11th gen, then definitely do check out that link to see if there's an update. Also, the board supports Intel's Optane, which, yeah, I don't think it's actually had the impact on the market that they were hoping to. It certainly has for things like notebooks and ultralights, that kind of thing, but on the desktop I don't think there's many people that actually use it. And actually, question of the day, do you use Intel Optane? Let us know in the comment section below. So size of the box, pretty much usual, what you'd expect to see, so MSI logos, etc, loads of branding, but more importantly the back of the box gives us a better idea of what is actually going on here. So as you can see, going from the left hand side, we've got the extended heatsink, and let me tell you, the heatsink on this thing for the VRM is an absolute whopper. It's absolutely huge. I haven't taken it off the board, but I'm sure it's going to weigh around about 250 grams. It's probably one of the heaviest feeling heatsinks that I've felt on a motherboard for a very, very long time. Core boost is a particular feature of MSI, so because we've got locked processors and obviously the chipset itself doesn't allow any physical overclocking, such as multipliers, that kind of thing, Core Boost actually has the technology built into it to look at the chip, look at the thermals, look at the voltages, etc, and will allow the chip to boost up to its rated boost frequencies for longer periods depending on all those variables. And taking into account that, with the massive Vrm heatsink in there, if you have a decent cooler on your processor, then I'm pretty sure you're going to be able to boost those speeds up and keep them there longer than you would with a cheaper board, especially in the same class of chipset and definitely more than H410. In the bottom here, we've got about the latest network solution. So this supports 2.5 gigabits per second LAN, which is absolutely fantastic. That's using the Realtek 8125 chipset, so 2.5 gigabits LAN. Also, obviously, that does support downward speed, so gigabit and also 10100, should you still be using that. On this side, it talks about the M.2 shield, the Frozer, so that's a really nice heatsink which goes over your NVMe drive or your SATA drives in that top slot. And also you've got audio boost, so they've got an updated codec. This is using the ALC 1200 chipset, which isn't fantastic, but certainly does get the job done and gives you 7.1 audio plus optical out. Also included on this board, which I think is a really nice touch, and I think most manufacturers should be doing this by now, and that is the pre-installed I/O shield, which actually looks really, really good on this board, but we'll take a look at that when we take it out of the box. So let's take the board out and see what we get. Well, we've got a pretty good idea because we've just seen it on the box, but we'll go through the actual accessories and see what is included. So first of all, you get your installation guide and owner's manual, and it's actually a pretty good manual. Lots of depth there, lots of things you can go through. You can also get this as a PDF format, which again, I'll put the links for that in the video description. So if maybe you're considering this and you're not too sure what some of the pins are, and maybe I haven't described them particularly well in the video, you can go ahead and download the manual and find out a little bit more depth. Next up, we've got a MSI badge, so you can stick it on your case if you wanted to. You've also got an MSI leaflet, so they can sell you more stuff. There is a bag of 3 M.2 screws. Got one of these round things, not too sure what that is. Also, there is the quick installation guide, which is pretty much a universal thing from MSI. Covers Intel mountings, AMD mountings, all that kind of stuff. Also, we get a pair of antenna. That is for our integrated Wi-Fi and Bluetooth module. And you get a pair of SATA 6 gigabit per second cables, one of which has got dual straight ends, and one of which has got a 90-degree angle and a straight end. Okay, so looking at the motherboard itself, and as you can see, this is in the Micro ATX form factor. It is a little bit wider than what we're used to seeing on some boards, which for me personally is a good thing, because then you've got the extra mounting points on these outer edges for the extra pillars, etc. Absolutely great. And it is a really heavy board as well, exceptionally heavy. So if you're considering putting this into a lightweight that you can carry around, think again, this is a heavy bad boy. So let's start in the top corner. So obviously we've got this huge heatsink, which is literally huge. They've done a really fantastic job actually. One of the main differences between this board and the actual non-Wi-Fi version is also the color as well. The non-Wi-Fi version, most of this is blacked out. So really, if it's an aesthetic choice, maybe you're building a system and you want some extra parts in there which are this kind of silver color or kind of chrome color, and you want them to pick up on your RGB highlights, then this is a really good option. Again, it is very much one of those personal choices. Yeah, if you want the Wi-Fi, you get the nicer color in my opinion. If you don't want the non-Wi-Fi, then you get the blacked out board. Your choice. But anyway, both boards are pretty much identical in spec, obviously apart from the integrated Wi-Fi. So let's take a tour of some of the connections. So up in this top corner, we've got an 8-pin supplementary power connector for your CPU, which is tucked away in there. It is a little bit too tucked away in my opinion with a lot of these new heat sinks. It's very common on a lot of boards, a lot of them do this now, so shouldn't be too much of a problem, but obviously do bear in mind if you're in a case where the top of the board is right up in that top corner, just do bear that in mind, might be a little bit tricky. Also in this section, obviously we've got our VRMs. Now the VRMs in this board are listed on MSI site as being a 12+1+1 phase setup. So tons and tons of phases there. I think from what I can see from the board, haven't taken this apart yet to have a look underneath, but I'm pretty sure it's actually 6 phases with doublers, so not quite a 12 phase setup, but certainly we'll definitely get the job done. And it does support up to the latest and greatest of the 10th gen Intel i9 processor. So there's no real limitations on what you can put on this board. Obviously do take that into consideration. Moving along, we've got next one of our Vrm Heatsinks, which is again another chunky one, and just from feeling the weight of the board, I'm sure that has got to be in the region of about 120, 130 grams. I may decide after to actually take those apart and actually put them on the scales, but you get the general idea. There is probably about, I would say about 350 grams worth of heatsink there, which is actually a tremendous amount, especially considering there is no technical overclocking on this board. It's purely done on boost frequencies. So yeah, it's a strange situation. It really, really is. So anyway, we've got the LGA 1200 socket on there, so please, if you're considering this for an AMD build, ain't gonna work. If you're considering it for an older Intel chip, 9th gen, ain't gonna work. This is currently 10th gen only, so do make sure, if you're thinking of buying this board, make sure you get a 10th gen processor to go with it. Moving on to the side, so we've got 4 RAM slots, which is excellent, especially for a micro ATX board. Mid-range boards generally do tend to have 4 slots. It's the cheaper boards and the H410s, which normally have dual slot setups. This will support up to 128 gigabytes of RAM, and unfortunately there are limitations on that. So if you're using most Intel processors, you're going to top out at 2666. If you're using a i7, i9, then some of them go up to 2933. Unfortunately, there is no other headroom than that. If you do want to have more headroom than that, then you are going to be looking at the next boards up, unfortunately. Although saying that, as we know, Intel chips don't suffer as much with RAM speeds as their AMD brethren, so potentially the RAM speeds aren't going to be a big deal. But if to you they are, then obviously you may wish to consider a different chipset or switch over to AMD. Moving over to our connections, so at the top here we've got our CPU fan connector, which actually seems to be miles away from the CPU area, but I guess that's the way things are going nowadays. Also, we've got our pump fan connector, so that is a multi-purpose header. You can use that for a pump, for an AIO, or you can use it for a fan. All of it is controllable from the MSI Dragon Center software and also in the BIOS itself. Tons of flexibility, and actually that is another reason why I chose for an MSI board. I really do appreciate their BIOS and the way all their fan headers work. It does make life extremely easy during setup. Underneath that, we've got our diagnostic D-LEDs, so these are really handy. So if you're having issues after building a system and it's not posting for some reason, then you do have these diagnostic LEDs on here to work out what is going on. I think for this particular setup, it's not actually going to be that big of an issue. Obviously, because you've got limited support for CPUs, it's only 10th gen, there isn't a BIOS flashback button on here on the back, so you don't have to worry about things like that. So essentially, the only things which are going to be preventing you from actually booting are going to be things like anything not plugged in or actually a real hardware fault. So if your CPU is faulty, although Intel CPU faulty, bit of an oxymoron there, I don't think that's ever happened, but certainly it could be, or not installed quite correctly. So you've got the diagnostic LEDs there. Maybe if you haven't got one of your RAM sticks fully seated, then you can get an error message there. If your GPU is not fully inserted, again, you can get an error code come up there. Or if you've just not got any boot devices, then you'll get the boot device error on the end. But certainly is a little bit better than having nothing at all. And for slightly newer builders, or actually even experienced builders, we can all make mistakes on a build, so it's quite nice to have those D-LEDs there, so it can take some of the guesswork out of fault finding. Moving down, we've got our 24-pin ATX power connector, and then underneath that we've got our USB Type-C front connector, which is a really nice thing to see on a board, especially at this price point. As we move down further, we've got 6 SATA ports there. Now, if you are using the SATA ports, if you are going to be drive heavy, if you are using your M.2 Shield Frozer, this top slot, then you do lose SATA port 1. It's all part of the way that it's all made in the system. So, yeah, do bear that in mind. You can't populate all 6 of those and both M.2 slots. There are limitations. Again, if you want full explanation on how all that works, then click on the links in the video description and you can go to the MSI site to get the full technical specs. Next up, we've got our Chipset Cooler, which has got the Mortar logo on there. Again, really nice to see. Tons and tons of heatsink on this thing. It really is crazy on heatsinks. Down in this bottom corner, we've got our front panel connector. Next to that, we've got our trusted platform module connector. Also, we've got a USB 3.0 connector for your front panels for the typical Type A type slots. And also there is a speaker connection there. So if you want to use a diagnostic speaker for BIOS beeps, that kind of thing, you can plug one of those guys in there. Next up, we've got a couple of USB 2.0 ports. So again, if you want to add in another front panel header or maybe a front panel card reader, that sort of thing, you can use those for sure. Next up is our addressable RGB header. Yay, addressable RGB. Sorry, carrying on. Next up, we've got another fan header. Again, 4-pin PWM, so can be used for fans, AIOs, etc, etc. All controllable in the BIOS. Next up, we've got these two unusual looking connectors. Now these are actually slightly unusual because I've not really used them before, and these are for the add-on Thunderbolt card. So there is actually an accessory you can get from MSI, which is a Thunderbolt card, which can be put into one of the PCI Express blanking plates on the back, and those two ports are where you plug that into. Next to that, we've got our traditional old school 12 volt RGB. If you are still using that, then there is a header for it there. And then moving along at the very bottom, we've got our HD audio connector. Moving up, we've got our PCI Express Gen 3 x4 slot. It's a x16 size slot, but it's only wired for x4. So maybe if you've got maybe a Wi-Fi card or a capture card, something like that, and you can't quite fit it in this because you've got a big graphics card, then you can always use the bottom slot if you wanted to. Or it does actually support AMD's Crossfire technology. So if you are brave enough to go Crossfire, then you can certainly use that slot for Crossfire. There's a couple of other connectors here, which actually aren't listed in the documentation, so not entirely sure what they are for. If anyone knows, please do let me know. And also we've got our CMOS reset. So moving upwards, we've got our PCI Express Gen 3 x1 slot there. And then we've also got our PCI Express Gen 3 16X slot there, also with the added support there of the metal. Then we've got our M.2 slot, so that is supporting NVMe and SATA drives, both M.2, and that will support drives up to a size 2280, so yeah, no issues there. You cannot use Wi-Fi cards and that kind of stuff in there, so that is purely for NVMe drives and also SATA type M.2 drives. This one down here, the Turbo M.2, that is suitable for Optane memory modules and NVMe. This one does not support SATA. Moving up slightly above our CMOS battery, we've got another fan header. So if you've got a fan header or fan in your case, kind of this situation here, then you can plug straight into there, which is always handy to have. But otherwise, I think that is pretty much it. Having a quick look on the back before we look at the I/O, pretty much the usual setup. All of the heatsinks are easily accessible, just a couple of screws and they'll pop out, rather than being those horrible plastic clips that some of these things use. But other than that, yeah, pretty much usual deal there. You can see actually on the back there is an isolation track for the audio, so that is designed to reduce audio static and noise coming through from the motherboard itself to your kind of HD audio section. Moving on to the back, again, we've got this included I/O shield, which is really, really cool. You've got a keyboard and mouse port, a bit old school, but certainly can come in useful sometimes. Then underneath that, you've got a pair of USB ports. You've got a display port and an HDMI port. Now these are for use if you're using an iGPU, so if you're using a non-F chip in here, so say the regular 10100, then that has got integrated Intel graphics, so you can use those ports there. The HDMI ones support up to 4K 30Hz, and the display port will support up to 4K 60Hz. Now that is going to be dependent also on the chip that you put in there and what is it actually capable of, but the ports themselves are capable of those specs. Next up, we've got the USB 3.2 port, so there is a Type A port and a Type C port. And then next to that, there is another two USB 3.2 ports there, both Type A. And above that, we've got that Realtek RTL 8125 2.5 gigabits Ethernet jack. Again, does support backwards compatibility with gigabit and also 10100. Then we've got our two ports there for our Wi-Fi. So that is the AC200 on there, so you just attach your antennas to those. And then moving down, we've got our audio. So this supports up to 7.1 audio and also has got an optical SpeedIF. So that is pretty much the full tour of the board. Sorry it's taken so long, but what we're going to do is now I'm going to put the processor onto the board and we'll fire it up, get the BIOS up, and we'll take a quick look at the BIOS. Okay, so this is the Mortar BIOS. And actually when it first came on, there was a message asking what sort of cooler you're using, whether it's a box cooler, all-in-one, that kind of thing. So it will automatically set up those kind of devices, which is great. So first screen, as you can see, got our CPU speed 3.6 GHz, which is pretty much exactly the same as the Ryzen 3 3100, which they'll be replacing. And we've got our DDR speed of 2133. So we've got options. This is the kind of the basic setup. So we've got XMP Profile 1, And let's see what that is going to give us. Don't think it actually says there. Doesn't appear to be making any changes there. We'll change that in a minute. There is an advanced section, so you can go in and change everything manually. You can turn on or disable HD controller, set up RAID. You've got your easy LED control as well, so if you want to do that from there you can. And actually one thing I'm noticing straight away is the CPU core temperature is 30 degrees, ambient temperature in the room is about 22, 23. So it's only about 7 degrees over ambient in the BIOS. Yeah, it's looking pretty decent. Actually the cooler is actually quite quiet as well. In fact, the loudest thing in the setup at the moment is actually the power supply. Anyway, so we've got boot priority, all that kind of stuff. We haven't got a boot drive installed at the moment, so there's nothing to see there. So if we go into memory, we've got our current DRAM frequency, registering the Corsair, XMP profile DDR4 3000. So maybe we can enable that. So that's going to take it up to 2666 in the XMP setup. And in storage, we've got AHCI mode, and it reports obviously there's no drive, so that's what we expect to see. Fan information, so you can go in there and change your system fan settings, etc. Nice and easy layout there. And obviously you've got the help section. So you've got game boost and all that stuff, which is currently not available because this is not a K supported chip. And let's go into the advanced section, so F7. So this is the much more usual kind of layout that we're expected to see. So we've got motherboard settings, OC settings, our M flash, and you can save and create OC profiles in here, hardware monitor, and your board explorer. So if you're not too sure where something is on the board, you can always look in there and I'll tell you what it is. It's quite a nice little feature. Hardware monitor, if we go into there, and you can see all the different things, like you set up your smart fan, pump speeds, system and fan, etc. Make all your changes there. If you need to ever change between PWM or DC, you can change that in this section here, which on some aftermarket RGB fans is a necessity, and also quite a lot of cases that come with built-in fans, quite often they're DC fans. So if you go into your fan header, say system 1, change it to DC, generally you'll find you have better control. So yeah, that's pretty much what we expect to see in here. So if we go into motherboard settings, got your system status, etc., all the usual kind of stuff, BIOS revisions, yada yada yada. In the advanced section, you've got your PCI Express, your link speed. So if you're Gen 3, Gen 1, whichever, you can change that. So if you're using perhaps a cable, splitter cable, that kind of thing, then you can change all these things. You've got your latency timer, your above 4G memory for crypto, etc. You've got your boot settings and security, save and exit. OC wise, we've got OC mode, so you can apply all core overclocks, which obviously you can't do because you can type them in, but it won't stick because it is not a K chip. Your advanced CPU configuration, extreme memory profiles, etc. DRAM frequency, memory triet, DRAM timing, all that kind of stuff, and your voltage control, all that kind of stuff. And there's a few bits and pieces you can change there. CPU voltage offsets, all that kind of stuff. Memory Z, CPU features, so you can see what is available. Intel Virtual T-D technology, you can turn it on or off. Hard software guard extensions, all that kind of stuff. All the sort of things you'd expect to see, but I'm more interested in actually seeing if the XMP profile is going to stick. So let's save and exit. So go back into settings, and we'll do save and exit, and we'll do save changes and reboot, and we'll enable XMP, and we'll get ready on the delete key so we can go straight back into the BIOS to see what it picks up. And there we go. So it has picked up, even though it is supporting 3000 megahertz, it's just clocked it to the highest DDR speed that it can, so that's 2666. So if you're thinking of buying this and putting 3200 RAM or 3600 or whatever the RAM may be, obviously you're only going to get up to the DDR speed of 2666 with supported processors, maybe 2933 with i7 i9s. Anyway, I think that's going to pretty much wrap this up. If there's anything you needed to see in the BIOS, then please do let me know, or pop over to our Discord, and hopefully I'll have the system up and running so I can check out any features I may have missed in this brief intro. Okay, so there you go. There has been a introduction and a quick look at the BIOS in the MSI B460M Mortar Wi-Fi. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If you have, don't forget to smash the like button, and if you're new here, don't forget to click on the subscribe button and also the chime icon, and you'll be notified of future video releases. Now obviously this will be going into the PC behind me as a swap out for the Ryzen 3 3100, and we'll be doing some direct comparisons between that particular B550 chipset against this B460 chipset and very comparable processors. At the moment as it stands, this is actually a formidable value. The processor itself around about £75, the motherboard around about 110, so pretty much the same price as a Ryzen 5 3600 as things stand at the moment, which if you think about it is pretty mental. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this one up now, so if you've got any comments or questions, leave them in the section below. But in the meantime, I've been Mike, this is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.